There is a stone in the ground outside Luoyang that records the precise season in which a governing class stopped existing. Why do the carved epitaphs of the Chinese great clans, produced continuously for 600 years, simply stop in the 880s and never resume? Why, when two economists at the Bank of Italy matched a Florentine tax ledger from 1427 against the Italian tax database of 2011, did the same surnames come up rich at both ends of 6 centuries? And why did the state legislature of South Dakota in 1983 quietly repeal a piece of English common law that had stood since the 1600s for the single purpose of stopping dead men from owning things forever? Those 3 questions have one answer. It has been assembled in pieces by historians who have never met each other, working in fields that do not read each other's journals. Tomb inscriptions, tax registers, bishop lists, prosopographies of the Soviet Nomenklatura. None of it is hidden, none of it is seriously contested, and put together it describes something almost nobody has said out loud, which is that a collapse is not an event that happens to everyone. It is a filter. The filter has a preference, and the preference has not changed in 1600 years. Tonight, we follow 4 separate civilizations into the wreckage with a list of names, and we find out who walks back out. Get comfortable and stay to the end, because by then you will be able to look at your own balance sheet and tell which half of it is built to burn. The research archive is on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which sits behind this channel and a few others like it. Members get every episode ad-free across all of them, plus early access before public release. Subscribe or join if you have not. Let's start where it started. On the 3rd of February, 1951, a man walked out of Landsberg prison in Bavaria, got into a car, and went home to a castle. His name was Alfried Krupp von Bohlen und Holbach. 4 years earlier, an American military tribunal sitting at Nuremberg had convicted him of plunder and of the enslavement of roughly 100,000 human beings. Some of them had been worked to death inside his own factories. Some of them were children. The sentence was 12 years in prison and the forfeiture of his entire industrial fortune. Every share, every mine, every blast furnace at Essen. The court did not simply punish a man. It dissolved a dynasty that had armed Prussia, then the Kaiser, then Hitler, across 4 generations. He served 3, and when he came out, an American lawyer named John J. McCloy handed the dynasty back to him. Not a portion of it. Not a settlement. The property order was vacated, and Alfried Krupp resumed his position as the sole proprietor of the largest industrial concern in Europe. Within a decade, he was, by most estimates, the richest man on the continent. 29 men walked out of Landsberg with him that morning. McCloy, as United States High Commissioner for Germany, had reviewed 89 remaining cases and reduced the sentences in 79 of them. Friedrich Flick, sentenced to 7 years for the same category of crime, went home and became the largest single shareholder in Daimler-Benz and the richest man in West Germany. He died in 1972 with a fortune that his family still holds. And then there is the one I keep coming back to, because it is the one that is hardest to sit with. Fritz Tamir was a board member of the chemical conglomerate IG Farben. He was the man responsible for the plant at Auschwitz-Monowitz, the industrial facility built beside the camp and staffed by prisoners who had a life expectancy measured in months. He was convicted at Nuremberg of plunder and enslavement. He was released in 1950. 6 years later, in 1956, he became chairman of the supervisory board of Bayer, the aspirin company, a position he held until 1964. He was not hiding. He was not living under an assumed name in Argentina. He was listed in the annual report. The chief American prosecutor at those trials, Telford Taylor, said the sentences handed down against the industrialists were light enough to please a chicken thief. He said that in public, at the time, and nothing happened. Now, the story you have probably heard about all of this is that the Cold War arrived, the Americans needed German industry back on its feet against the Soviets, and expediency won. That story is true. It is also almost completely beside the point, and the reason it is beside the point is what I want to spend the next 2 hours on. Because the same thing was happening in Tokyo. Nobusuke Kishi had been Minister of Commerce and Industry in the Tojo cabinet. He co-signed the declaration of war against the United States. He was arrested as a Class A war crimes suspect and held at Sugamo prison for 3 years. He was released in 1948 without ever being tried. 9 years later, he was the Prime Minister of Japan. His grandson Shinzo Abe would hold the same office more than half a century after that, and it was happening 700 years earlier on the other side of the world, and 1,000 years before that in the ruins of the Roman West, and it happened again, in front of cameras, in Moscow between 1991 and 1996, at a scale that makes Krupp look like a shoplifter. There is a belief that sits underneath almost everything people think about history, and almost nobody has ever examined it, because it feels less like a belief and more like the flaw. The belief is that collapse is the great leveler, that when a system goes down, the people who ran it go down with it, that the guillotine, the firing squad, the mob, the currency reform, the occupying army, the tribunal eventually come for the top, that whatever else is unfair about the arrangement of the world, there is at least a reckoning built into the structure of things, and it arrives when the structure fails. It is a comforting belief. It is also, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, false, and we do not have to argue about it, because it has been measured. There are prosopographies. There are tax registers. There are 30,000 excavated tomb epitaphs. There are surname databases running 600 years. Historians have gone through the wreckage of 4 separate civilizational ruptures with a list of names, and they have traced where those names went. The question I want to hold open for the whole of this, and I am going to warn you now that I do not think it closes cleanly, is not whether elites survive collapse. That part is settled, and the evidence is overwhelming. The question is what specifically survives. Because when you look closely at the 4 best documented cases, the thing that carries across is never the thing you expect. It is not the money. Krupp's money was confiscated by court order and it came back anyway, which means the money was not the load-bearing element. Something else was, and whatever it was, a tribunal could not reach it. The question is this: when everything liquid burns, what is the residue, and why does the new regime always end up handing it back? I want to plant one thing here before we go any further, and I am not going to explain it yet, because it will not mean anything to you until we have gone through the cases. In every single episode we are about to look at, the elite that got destroyed and the elite that survived differed in one structural respect, and it was not their wealth, their cleverness, their ruthlessness, or their popularity. It was a question of geography, of where the assets physically were relative to the thing that was falling. Keep that at the back of your mind. It becomes the whole story at the end, and it becomes the reason the modern chapter of this is not a repeat of the historical pattern, but a break from it. Start with what actually happened to Krupp, because the mechanics matter more than the outrage. The confiscation order was real. In 1948, the tribunal did strip him of his holdings, and for 3 years those holdings were legally not his. What McCloy's clemency did was vacate that order. But think about what that required. It required that somebody in the intervening 3 years had kept the enterprise running, kept the accounts, kept the plant from being dismantled entirely, kept the technical staff employed, kept the customer relationships alive. It required that the entity called Krupp still existed as a going concern with a functioning management layer, so that there was something to hand back. And the people who did all of that were the same people who had run it under the Reich, because they were the only people who knew how. That is the first appearance of the mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The Allies did not restore Krupp because they liked Krupp. They restored Krupp because they needed steel, and the men who knew how to make steel at scale in the Ruhr were, without exception, the men who had made steel for Hitler. The alternative was not a fairer arrangement. The alternative was no steel. Denazification in the American zone processed something in the region of 3.5 million cases. It ran into a wall almost immediately, and the wall was not sympathy for Nazis. It was that West Germany needed a functioning civil service, a judiciary, a police force, a school system, and a tax authority. And every single person qualified to staff those institutions had spent 12 years working for the party. In 1951, the Bundestag passed a law, known in German shorthand as the 131 Law after the article of the Basic Law it implemented, which restored pension rights and employment to civil servants who had served the previous regime. The man who helped draft it was Hans Globke. I want you to hold Globke for a second, because he is the purest specimen in the entire story. In 1936, Hans Globke co-authored the official legal commentary on the Nuremberg race laws. Not the laws themselves, the commentary. The document that told German judges and administrators how to apply the definition of a Jew in practice, how to count grandparents, how to handle the edge cases. It is one of the most consequential pieces of administrative writing in the 20th century, and it is written in the flat, careful, procedural voice of a competent civil servant, which is exactly what he was. From 1953 to 1963, he was Chief of Staff of the West German Chancellery under Konrad Adenauer. In that role, he controlled personnel appointments across the federal government. He was, by wide agreement among historians of the period, one of the 2 or 3 most consequential men in the country. Adenauer knew exactly who he was, and kept him anyway, and when challenged about it made a remark that has been repeated ever since, to the effect that you do not throw away dirty water when you have no clean water. Here is what makes this more than an anecdote about one hypocrite. Germany, to its considerable credit, eventually commissioned independent historians to go through its own ministries and count. The results came out slowly, and they came out late. An independent commission examining the West German Interior Ministry reported in November 2015 that 54% of its senior staff between 1949 and 1970 had been members of the Nazi Party, and that a substantial number of those had also belonged to the SS or the SA. A separate study of the Chancellery found that among senior civil servants born before 1918, 3 out of 50 had any record of resistance. Party membership in that cohort was not the exception. It was the baseline condition of employment. These reports were published. They were covered in the German press. They are available in English. And I would guess that if you polled 100 well-educated people in any Western country about the composition of the post-war West German state, you would not find one who could tell you the figure was above half. That is the first instance of something that recurs through every case in this story, and it is worth naming now. None of this is hidden. There is no archive to break into. The scandal is not that the information is suppressed. The scandal is that it is fully published, fully sourced, fully available, and it has not made the slightest dent in what people believe about how collapse works. The information and the belief exist in separate compartments and never touch. Now, Japan. The American occupation of Japan set out to do something more ambitious than denazification. It set out to dismantle the economic structure of the country. The Zaibatsu, the enormous family-controlled conglomerates that had financed the war, were targeted by a body called the Holding Company Liquidation Commission. In December 1947, the occupation passed a law usually translated as the Elimination of Excessive Concentration of Economic Power Law, and under it 325 companies were designated for breakup. 11 were broken up. That is the number. 325 designated, 11 actually dissolved. What happened in between was the reverse course, the strategic pivot that followed the Chinese Communist victory in the beginning of the Korean War, and the specific mechanism was that General MacArthur appointed a review board composed largely of American businessmen to reconsider the designations. They reconsidered nearly all of them. The Zaibatsu did not come back under their old legal form. They came back as something more durable. The Keiretsu, the post-war corporate groupings clustered around a main bank and bound by cross-shareholdings, carried the same names. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo. The families no longer owned them outright. The groups no longer had a holding company at the apex. And it made almost no difference to who ran what, because the cross-shareholding structure achieved by contract and custom what the holding company had achieved by ownership. By the mid-1950s, the concentration was back. The public office purge removed something in the region of 200,000 people from positions of authority. Then, between 1950 and 1952, the depurge returned them. Kishi went from Sugamo prison to the Diet to the office of Prime Minister in 9 years, and the Americans who had jailed him funded his party. And the bureaucracy was never touched at all. Chalmers Johnson, in his 1982 study of the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry, traced a direct institutional line from the wartime Ministry of Munitions to the post-war ministry that engineered the Japanese economic miracle. Same building, same filing cabinets, substantially the same men, planning industrial output for a nation at peace using the tools they had developed for planning it at war. 2 occupations, 2 continents, 2 comprehensive programs to destroy an entrenched elite, both designed by the same victorious power, both backed by the full weight of military government, both with the moral authority of having just won a war against genocide. Both reversed inside a decade, but here is where I have to stop and be honest with you, because if I let you walk away from Japan with only that, I would be lying by omission, and the whole point of doing this properly is that the honest version is more interesting than the clean one. The occupation of Japan did destroy an elite, utterly, permanently. It just was not the one you have been watching. Beginning in January 1946, and formalised in the owner-farmer establishment law of October that year, the occupation carried out a compulsory land reform. Absentee landlords were permitted to keep nothing. Resident landlords were permitted to keep a strictly limited area. In most of the country, about 1 hectare of land they farmed themselves, and a small additional holding they could rent out. Everything above the threshold was purchased by the state at a fixed price and resold to the tenants who worked it. Roughly 2 million hectares changed hands. The proportion of Japanese farmland worked by tenants fell from about 46% to about 10%. Something on the order of 4 million tenant families became owner cultivators. The landlords were paid. That is the detail that decides everything. They were paid in government bonds at prices fixed in 1945 yen, and Japan then went through an inflation that reduced the real value of those payments to something between a token and a joke. A class that had held the Japanese countryside for centuries, that had supplied the officer corps and the local political machinery, and a substantial slice of the national elite, was compensated into non-existence. John Dower, in his History of the Occupation, describes the rural landlord class as virtually dispossessed, and he is not overstating it. They did not reconstitute. There was no reverse course for them. There is no kuretsu of former landowners. We have, inside the same occupation, run by the same administration, in the same 5-year window, a comprehensive failure to displace the industrial and bureaucratic elite, and a total success in destroying the rural one. Whatever the difference is, it is not political will. The will was applied evenly. The outcome was not. And the difference, once you see it, is almost insultingly simple. Japanese farmland was on a register. Every parcel had a recorded owner, a recorded area, a recorded tenant, and a recorded rent. It could not be moved, hidden, converted, or carried out of the country in a briefcase. When the occupation decided to take it, the taking required nothing more than a clerk, a map, and a printing press for the bonds. The asset was fully legible to the state, and therefore the asset was fully available to the state. Fritz Tamir's actual asset was not legible to anybody. It was the knowledge of how to run a chemical works employing tens of thousands of people, and the relationships with the men who ran the other chemical works, and the standing among that group that made him the obvious person to chair the board. You cannot register that. You cannot purchase it at a fixed price. You cannot resell it to the tenants. The tribunal took his liberty, and it took the shares, and it could not touch the thing that made the shares come back. Hold that distinction, because we are going to test it against the hardest case there is. Everything so far has happened inside states that continued to exist. Germany and Japan were occupied, humiliated, restructured and impoverished. But there was a government the whole time, and there were courts, and there was a record. What happens to an elite when the state does not survive at all? Not defeated. Gone. No successor administration, no tribunal, no register, no currency, no roads, no post. For that we have to go to Gaul in the 5th century, and I have to tell you about a man who wrote too many letters. Gaius Solius Modestus Apollinaris Sidonius was born in Lyon around the year 430 into a family that had supplied prefects to the Roman state for 3 generations. His father-in-law, Avitus, briefly became emperor. Sidonius himself was made prefect of the city of Rome in 468, which by that point was a magnificent title attached to a job of steeply declining significance. He wrote poetry that was praised in his lifetime and is generally considered mediocre now. He owned an estate near Clermont called Aviticum, and he described it in his letters in the loving, slightly boastful detail of a man who wants you to know about the bathhouse. And then, over the course of his adult life, the Western Roman state around him ceased to function, not in a single dramatic collapse, in the way these things actually happen, which is as a long sequence of arrangements that stop being honoured. The tax revenue from Africa stopped arriving because the Vandals had taken Africa. The army stopped being paid in coin because there was no coin. The Visigoths, formerly allies, became in practice the government of southern Gaul, and then in 475 the imperial administration formally ceded the Auvergne to them, which is to say it handed Sidonius and everyone he knew to a foreign king, in writing, in exchange for something else. Sidonius Apollinaris, senator, prefect, poet, landowner, had by then done something that would have been unthinkable to his grandfather. He had become a bishop. He was not a priest. He had no theological training worth mentioning. He was, as far as anyone can tell, not conspicuously devout. Around the year 469, the See of Clermont fell vacant, and the local population and the local aristocracy selected him, and he was consecrated, and he spent the rest of his life running the church of a city he then had to defend against the Visigothic siege of 474. He was not unusual. He was typical. That is the entire point. Across 5th and 6th century Gaul, the senatorial aristocracy, the class that had run the Western Empire, moved into the Catholic episcopate more or less en bloc. The families are traceable by name. The Aviti, the Apollinaris, the Ferioli, the Siagri. They are the same names that appear in the imperial office lists of the 4th century. And then they appear in the episcopal lists of the 6th, and in between the state they had served evaporated. The single most extraordinary piece of evidence for this comes from a bishop of Tours named Georgius Florentius, who took the name Gregory and who wrote the history that is our main source for the whole period. In the course of it, defending his own lineage, Gregory of Tours mentions almost in passing that of the 18 bishops of Tours who preceded him, all but 5 were his relatives, 13 out of 18. And at the moment of his birth, around the year 538, members of his family were simultaneously holding the sees of Tours, Lyon and Langres. A bishopric was not supposed to be heritable. There is no theological provision for it whatsoever. Bishops were, in principle, elected by the clergy and people of the city, and what the record shows is a small number of families passing the office among themselves for generation after generation, while the formal rule of election remained perfectly intact and was never once amended. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets repeated in a distorted form, and the honest version has a dispute inside it that you should know about. 2 German scholars did the counting, and they got dramatically different answers. Carl Friedrich Strohecker, in 1948, published a study of the senatorial aristocracy in late antique Gaul using a strict legal definition of senatorial rank. On that definition, he could identify only 19 bishops of senatorial origin across 4 centuries, and of those only 9 could be called certain. Martin Heinzelmann, working in 1976 on episcopal lordship in Gaul, used a broader definition of aristocracy. The German word Adel, meaning something closer to the recognized nobility of a region than a specific inherited legal status. Of the 179 Gallic bishops whose social origins he could establish, he assigned 171 to the aristocracy, 19 across 4 centuries, or 171 out of 179. That is not a small disagreement. It is the difference between a curiosity and a total capture of the institution, and the gap between the 2 figures is almost entirely a gap between definitions rather than between facts. Both men were looking at the same men. They disagreed about what counted as a senator. I lean toward Heinzelmann, and so do most working historians of the period now. But I am telling you about Strohecker because I think you should be able to see the joints in this. The specific number is contested. The pattern is not. Nobody in the field argues that the Gallic episcopate was drawn from the general population. Why the church, though? That is the part that actually explains the mechanism, and it is not about faith. A bishop in 5th century Gaul held things that a Roman senator no longer held. He had a physical building, usually the largest in the city, that nobody was going to burn. He had jurisdiction, because the imperial legal system had ceded a widening slice of civil dispute resolution to episcopal courts and then stopped existing, leaving the episcopal courts as the only courts. He had land, because the church had been receiving donations of land for a century and a half and never sold any of it. He had control of the grain dole and the charitable distributions, which in a famine is the difference between a city that riots and a city that does not. He had literacy in an environment where literacy was collapsing, and critically, he had a relationship with the incoming Germanic kings that no other Roman figure had, because those kings were mostly Arian Christians ruling Catholic populations, and they needed an intermediary who could keep the population quiet. Ralph Matheson, in his study of aristocratic survival strategies in barbarian Gaul, puts it in terms that are almost administrative. As secular careers closed, careers shifted into the church hierarchy, and certain bishoprics became in effect family holdings. Think about what that actually is. It is a class noticing that the institution it works for is going to fail, identifying the one institution in the environment that will not fail and moving into it before the failure completes. The Roman aristocracy did not survive the fall of Rome by hiding, or fighting, or fleeing. It survived by changing employer on schedule while the old employer was still nominally solvent. And this brings me to the thing I planted earlier, which I said I would not explain yet. I am going to give you the second version of it now, still incomplete. The Gallic families survived, but there was another group of senatorial families whose wealth was concentrated differently, and they did not. We know roughly what the great late Roman fortunes looked like, because a historian named Olympiodorus of Thebes, writing in the 5th century, recorded the incomes of the senatorial houses of Rome, the greatest of them, and he names the general category rather than always the family. Drew something in the region of £4,000 of gold a year from their estates. Middling senators, and I want you to feel the weight of the word middling here, drew between £1,000 and £1,500. Peter Brown, whose book on wealth and the early church is the standard work, wrote that these were fortunes on a scale that would not be seen again in Europe until the industrial millionaires of the 19th century. The best documented single fortune belonged to a woman named Melania the Younger, born around 383. According to the life written by her chaplain Gerontius, she and her husband Pinianus had an annual income of 120,000 gold solidi and held property in Italy, Sicily, Africa, Numidia, Mauritania, Spain, Britain and Gaul. 8 provinces. When they decided to renounce their wealth and give it away. The sale of the Roman estates alone was so large that it threatened to destabilize local property markets, and the Senate objected. Here is the part that I find genuinely difficult to think about clearly. The reason we know the figure is that a hagiographer recorded it in order to make her renunciation look more impressive, and a scholar named Geoffrey Dunn has argued, persuasively, that Melania and Pinianus did not in fact end up poor at all, that they retained a great deal, and that the total renunciation is a literary construction over a preserved fortune, which would mean the largest documented act of voluntary elite self-dispossession in the ancient world may partly have been an accounting exercise. I do not know how to settle that. I am telling you it is contested because I think you should hold the numbers loosely. But the geography of that fortune is the thing. 8 provinces: Italy, Sicily, Africa, Numidia, Mauritania, Spain, Britain, Gaul. Now, watch what happens to that map over the following century. Britain goes first and goes completely. And the Roman landowning class there does not so much decline as vanish from the archaeological record. Africa and Numidia and Mauritania go to the Vandals in the 430s, and with them goes the grain supply and the rent roll that had underwritten the Roman aristocracy for 300 years. Spain fragments. Italy becomes a war zone for the better part of a century. Gaul holds, and the families whose property was concentrated in Gaul are the families that are still there, holding bishoprics in the year 600. The families whose wealth was in the provinces that went are simply not in the 6th century sources. They did not adapt. They were not clever or stupid. Their property was in the wrong place. That is the second time I have shown you this, and I still have not drawn the conclusion. Stay with it. Because there is a much harder problem with the Roman case, and if I skip it you will rightly stop trusting me. The problem is that these families survived, in a sense, into a world so much poorer than the one they started, in that the word survival starts to strain. Brian Ward Perkins, at Oxford, spent a career assembling the archaeological case against the comfortable modern view that the end of the Roman West was a transformation rather than a fall. His evidence is not literary, and it is very hard to argue with. Wheel-thrown pottery disappears from most of the West. Coinage disappears. The amphorae that carried oil and wine across the Mediterranean stop being manufactured. Roof tiles vanish from the record in Britain, and so do coffins, which is a detail that has stayed with me since I first read it, because it means that within 2 or 3 generations, a population that had buried its dead in manufactured containers had lost the capacity to make them. Ward Perkins calls it a time of horror and dislocation that destroyed a great civilization, and he is right. Chris Wickham, also at Oxford, wrote what is probably the most important single book on the period, and he gives the nuance that matters most for our purposes. His finding is that, with the exception of the elites of Gaul and Syria, post-Roman aristocrats were poorer than their imperial predecessors. In Britain, the aristocracy did not become poorer. It disappeared as a wealth-holding class entirely, to the point where archaeologists cannot reliably identify elite settlement at all for a long stretch. The Gallic families kept their position while the total quantity of wealth in the system collapsed. Their villas got smaller, and then stopped being villas. Their material culture simplified. Their horizons narrowed from an empire to a diocese. The great estates in Africa were gone and were never coming back. What they kept was rank. Precedence, the right to be the person the room turns to. And I want to argue that this is not a consolation prize, because rank is convertible and quantity of wealth is not. A family that is poorer but still first in its region will be rich again in 3 generations whenever conditions allow. A family that is rich but has lost its position will be neither in 1, which is the first real answer to our question, and it is going to fail, but it fails productively. The answer is that what survives collapse is not wealth. It is relative standing inside whatever hierarchy is still functioning. Krupp lost the shares and kept the standing and got the shares back. Sidonius lost the empire and kept the standing and got a bishopric. But if that were the whole answer, then relative standing would be indestructible, and it is not. There is a case where it was destroyed so completely that the class in question does not appear in the historical record afterward at all, and it is the case I find the most disturbing in this entire story, partly because it is the best documented, and partly because of how the documentation was assembled. For about 600 years, the government of China was run by an aristocracy. Not a gentry, not a bureaucracy of talent, an aristocracy in the strict sense. A set of great clans identified by surname and by ancestral place of origin, who intermarried with each other, monopolized high office, and maintained an elaborate internal ranking of which lineages were superior to which. The Kui of Boling, the Lu of Fanyang, the Li of Zhaojun, the Zheng of Xinjiang. These were names with a prestige so entrenched that emperors of the Tang dynasty, who had a different surname and a certain amount of steppe ancestry, repeatedly attempted to have the official genealogies rewritten to place the imperial house higher, and repeatedly failed to make it stick socially. There is an anecdote, probably improved in the retelling but revealing regardless, of a Tang chancellor expressing regret at the end of a distinguished life that he had never managed to marry into one of the top families. For most of the 20th century, the standard account of what happened to these clans was that they faded, that the examination system, expanded under the Tang and made central under the Song, gradually diluted their monopoly, that new men rose on merit, and that the aristocracy gently dissolved into the broader elite over a couple of centuries. It is a tidy account. It is the account you would expect a modern meritocratic society to find plausible. In 2014, a historian at Berkeley named Nicholas Tackett published a book that took it apart. His method is the thing. Chinese elites of this period were buried with an epitaph carved on stone, a muziming, which typically recorded the deceased's name, ancestral home, official career, marriages, children and date of death. Tens of thousands of these have been excavated, mostly in the 20th century, mostly around the two capitals. Tackett built a database of them, thousands of individuals, and then did something that had not been done before. He mapped them. He geolocated the burials, reconstructed the marriage networks, and tracked where the great clans actually lived, rather than where their ancestral seats nominally were. What he found first was that the standard account was wrong in an unexpected direction. The clans had not been fading at all. They had adapted to the examination system extremely successfully, moving physically to the capital region around Zhongyan and Luoyang, converting their prestige into examination success and bureaucratic office, and consolidating rather than dispersing. By the 9th century, something like 79% of the highest officials had ties to the capital elite marriage network. The aristocracy was not being outcompeted by new men. It had absorbed the meritocratic machinery and was running it. And then, in the 1880s of our era, which is to say the 880s, a failed examination candidate turned salt smuggler named Huang Chao raised a rebellion, marched on the capitals and took them. The clans lived in the capitals. That was the adaptation that had made them so successful. It is also what killed them. What followed was roughly 30 years of intermittent massacre. The rebels sacked Chang'an. Warlords sacked it again. In 904, a warlord named Zhu Wen forced the evacuation of Chang'an, had the buildings dismantled and the timber floated downriver, and marched the population out. The city, which had been the largest in the world, was effectively deleted. Officials were killed en masse. There is an episode, recorded in the histories, in which a group of senior officials was executed and their bodies thrown into the Yellow River, with the remark attributed to the perpetrators that these men who considered themselves pure could now become muddy. Tackett opens his book with the epitaph of a woman he calls Ms. Lu, of the Fanyang Lu, one of the most prestigious lineages in China. The epitaph records that in the year 880 she died along with 4 of her 5 children, none of whom left heirs. Through her marriage and her ancestry, 3 great lineages ended in that one household in that one year. The tomb epitaphs stop. That is the finding. The corpus that had been produced continuously for centuries by the same families simply ends, and when the record resumes under the song 100 years later, the great clans are not in it, not diminished. Absent whatever the song elite was, and we are about to get to what it was not the Tang aristocracy in reduced circumstances. It was a different set of people. Here is a case where a deeply entrenched, 600-year-old, socially unassailable elite was destroyed, not humbled. Destroyed, and I have to put it in front of you at this point in the argument rather than at the end, because if I saved it for later, it would look like I was hiding it, and because the way it fails is more instructive than the cases that succeed. 2 things were required, and both of them were required. The first is that the killing had to be physical, extended and indiscriminate, not a purge of office holders, which is what Nuremberg and the Japanese public office purge were. The elimination of families, including women and children, across 3 decades, by multiple actors, with no central authority capable of stopping it. The second is that the elite had to be concentrated in a place that could be reached. They had moved to the capital, all of them more or less over 2 centuries, because the capital was where the offices were, and the offices were where the power was, and when the capital was destroyed, they were in it. Ward Perkins would recognise this. Melania's heirs, whoever they were would recognize it. Concentration is efficient and concentration is fatal, and the elites who survive are, without exception, the ones who are somewhere else. Now, what replaced them is where this story gets genuinely strange, because the Chinese elite that emerged after the catastrophe appears to have learned the lesson and then engineered a solution that has no precedent I know of anywhere else in the pre-modern world. The successor elite is usually called the gentry, or in Chinese the shenxi, and the shorthand definition is the families that held examination degrees and land at the local level. They were not aristocrats. There were no ranked lineages, no official genealogies, no legal privilege attached to birth. In principle, any male could sit the examinations, and the state was actively hostile to the idea of a hereditary governing class. And in practice, the same families held local dominance for centuries across multiple dynastic transitions, and the question of how they did it produced one of the great arguments in the historiography of China. On one side, Ping Ti Ho, whose book on social mobility in imperial China came out in 1962, went through the lists of successful candidates in the highest level examinations across the Ming and Qing dynasties, some 540 years of records, and found that a substantial proportion of successful candidates came from families with no office holding in the preceding 3 generations. His conclusion was that the examination system produced real and significant mobility, that the ladder was genuinely there and genuinely climbable, and that China had a more fluid elite than pre-modern Europe. On the other side, a group of historians working from local rather than national records, and Robert Himes at Columbia is the sharpest of them, went into the archives of a single prefecture, Fuzhou, in Jiangxi, and reconstructed the actual families. What they found was that the same families dominated locally over long periods, regardless of whether any particular generation passed the examinations. Success in the examinations was a fluctuating outcome. Local dominance was the constant. And the mechanisms that produced the constant were marriage alliances with other local elite families, control of land, control of local institutions like academies and granaries and irrigation systems, and a strategy of spreading sons across multiple careers so that the family never depended on any one of them. Both are right, and the way they are both right is the important part. If you look at individuals, there is mobility. If you look at families, there is not. A given man from a modest background could pass the examination and enter the elite, and that happened often enough to be statistically real and to sustain the belief in the system across a millennium. Meanwhile, the families that were locally dominant in 1500 were substantially the families that were locally dominant in 1800, having passed through a foreign conquest in the interval, and the instrument that made that possible was invented in the year 1050 by a man named Fan Zhongyan. Fan Zhongyan was a senior official, a reformer, a general, and the author of a line that every educated Chinese person could quote for the next 900 years, about being the first to bear the world's troubles and the last to enjoy its pleasures. He came from a family that had been poor. His father died when he was 2, his mother remarried, and he was raised under a different surname and did not learn his real ancestry until adulthood. He is, in the standard telling, the exemplar of the meritocratic ideal, the poor boy who rose by examination to the highest offices in the empire. And what he did with the position is establish something called the righteous estate at Suzhou. He purchased around 1,000 mu of farmland, and he vested it, not in himself, not in his sons, but in his lineage as a corporate body, in perpetuity, with written rules. The income from the land was to provide grain to all descendants of his ancestors, to fund weddings and funerals, and above all to fund a school so that clan sons could be educated for the examinations. Read the structure of that again, because I do not think its significance is obvious on first pass. The land is not owned by any person. It is owned by a lineage which is a legal fiction that does not die, Therefore it cannot be divided by inheritance, and Chinese inheritance law divided estates equally among sons, which is the single most reliable mechanism for destroying a great fortune in 3 generations. It cannot be sold by a spendthrift heir, because no heir owns it. It cannot easily be confiscated for the crime of an individual member, because the individual member does not hold it. And its income is directed at producing the one asset that is not confiscable at all, which is the education that produces degrees. Fan Zhongyan built a machine for turning land into credentials and credentials back into land, wrapped in a legal shell with no natural lifespan. And he did it because he had been poor and did not want his descendants to be. The Fan righteous estate operated, in some form, for roughly 800 years. I want to sit with that for a moment. 800 years. It survived the Mongol conquest. It survived the fall of the Yuan, the founding of the Ming, the collapse of the Ming, the Manchu conquest, 3 or 4 major peasant rebellions, the Taiping catastrophe, which killed something on the order of 20 million people and went directly through the Yangtze Delta where the estate sat, and it was still recognisably functioning into the era of steamships and telegraph. And this model was copied. By the Qing period, corporate lineage estates of this general type were widespread across southeastern China, and in some regions they held a very large share of all cultivated land. An enormous quantity of the productive property of the empire was held not by people, but by immortal fictional entities constituted for the specific purpose of maintaining the position of a family across time. This is the second time I am going to gesture at the thing I have not explained yet, and this time I will be a little more direct. The Chinese gentry, having watched an aristocracy get physically exterminated because its wealth was concentrated where the state could be attacked, invented a legal structure in which the wealth is not held by any person who can be killed and is not located in any office that can be abolished. They depersonalized the asset. 950 years later, the same solution would be arrived at again, in a different hemisphere, by lawyers who I am fairly confident had never heard of Fan Zhongyan. But the Chinese solution had a limit, and the limit is instructive, and it takes us to the ugliest part of this whole story. In April 1644, a rebel army took Beijing. The last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree on a hill behind the palace, and a Ming general at the northeastern frontier decided that he would rather deal with the Manchus than with the rebels. He opened the pass. The Qing dynasty entered China. What followed in the wealthy lower Yangtze region, the Jiangnan, was not a negotiated transition. In 1645, the Qing imposed the queue order, requiring all men to shave the front of the head and wear the Manchu braid, on pain of death. The slogan attached to it was that you keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and lose your hair. Jiangnan, the richest and most literate region in the empire and the heartland of the gentry, refused. The city of Yangzhou was stormed. The commander, Shi Kefa, was executed after refusing to surrender. The massacre that followed lasted, according to the eyewitness account written by a survivor named Wang Shuchu, 10 days. His account is one of the most harrowing documents in Chinese literature, and it is not the sort of thing I am going to summarize casually. The death toll traditionally given is 800,000, which is almost certainly too high, and modern estimates run lower, but nobody disputes that it was catastrophic. Jieding was massacred 3 times in the space of a few weeks. Jiang Yin held out for 81 days and was annihilated. Now here is what I find almost impossible to hold in my head at the same time as those facts. By the 1680s, Jiangnan was the wealthiest, most productive, most culturally dominant region of the Qing Empire. Its gentry families were sitting the Qing examinations in enormous numbers, and a very substantial proportion of the land was held by the same lineages that had held it under the Ming. The Qing did not redistribute land. They had no reason to. What they needed was tax revenue and local administration, and the people who could deliver both were the people who had been delivering them for the previous dynasty. The transition killed a great many individuals, and it did not touch the class. The lineage estates were not divided because there was no one to divide them from. The degrees were reissued under a new reign title. The marriage networks reconstituted. Within 40 years of one of the more comprehensively violent conquests in early modern history, the local elite of the conquered region was the local elite of the conquering empire. And that is the pattern that holds for about 1,000 years, through the Song, the Yuan, the Ming and the Qing, until the 20th century when it stops. The Agrarian Reform Law was promulgated in June 1950. Land reform in the newly established People's Republic was not primarily an economic program, though it was that too. It was a political ritual, and it was designed to be one. The method was the struggle session. A work team would arrive in a village, identify the landlords by class category, and organize the peasantry to accuse them publicly. The accusations were followed, very often by execution, and the execution was frequently carried out by villagers rather than by the state, which was the point. Participation was the mechanism by which a village was bound to the new order and could not go back. Frank de Cotta, working from provincial archives that opened in the 2000s, estimates that between 1947 and 1952, no fewer than 1.5 to 2 million people were killed as landlords. Other historians give lower figures, and the range in the literature runs from something around 1 million upward. The most commonly cited figure is between 1 and 2 million. More than 10 million households were expropriated. Something in the region of 43% of China's cultivated land changed hands to roughly 300 million peasants. The lineage estates were dissolved. The corporate property that had made the whole thing work for 9 centuries was seized as landlord property, which is what it was. The genealogies were burned, in many places literally, and the ancestral halls were converted into granaries and meeting rooms and schools. The Chinese gentry, having survived the Mongols, the Manchus, the Taiping, the fall of 4 dynasties and a foreign occupation, ended in the early 1950s. That is the honest verdict, and it should be stated plainly. But notice what it took. It took a state with total ideological commitment to the specific goal of destroying that class as a class, rather than punishing its members for particular acts. It took the physical killing of over 1 million people. It took the dissolution of a legal form. And it took a government willing to accept, for the sake of that goal, the near total disruption of agricultural administration in a country that was, within a decade, going to starve. Every case in which an elite has been permanently destroyed looks like that. Not one of them looks like a tribunal, a reform, an election, a wealth tax, or a change of regime. Which brings me to the objection that I know some of you have been holding since about 10 minutes in, because it is the obvious one, and I would be holding it too. The French Revolution. Surely the French Revolution is the counterexample. Surely that is the one clean case where a modern Western society took its aristocracy, put it in a cart, and disposed of it in public. The terror, the confiscations, the abolition of feudal privilege on the night of the 4th of August 1789. The whole point of the French Revolution, in the version that everyone carries around, is that the old elite was removed. It was not. Roughly 16 to 17,000 people were executed under the official terror by sentence of the revolutionary tribunals, with a larger number dying in the Vendée and in extrajudicial killings. The nobility was overrepresented among the victims relative to its share of the population, but in absolute terms the number of nobles executed is usually estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2,000. The Second Estate numbered somewhere around 120,000 to 350,000 people, depending on how you count. The revolution killed a small percentage of them. Noble land was confiscated on a large scale, particularly from émigrés, and then a great deal of it was bought back, often by the same families operating through intermediaries, often at distressed prices, and the process of restitution continued formally under Napoleon and then explicitly under the Restoration, when a law of 1825 awarded compensation to émigrés for confiscated property, financed by a government bond issue and known ever since as the émigrés billion. David Higgs, whose study of the 19th century French nobility is the standard work, found that nobles, who constituted well under 1% of the population, held something in the region of 40 to 50% of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies during the Restoration period from 1815 to 1830, and around a quarter under the July monarchy that followed. They retained a disproportionate presence in the officer corps, in the diplomatic service, and in the higher clergy well into the Third Republic. The great landowning families of the 18th century were, to a very substantial degree, the great landowning families of the 19th. The revolution destroyed the legal category of nobility twice, and it destroyed the specific institutional privileges attached to it permanently, and those are real and enormous achievements. It did not destroy the families. It changed what they were called, and it changed the mechanism by which they held on, and it left them holding on. And the Russian Revolution, which is the other case people reach for, is more complicated than it looks, in a way that turns out to be central to everything we are doing here. The Russian Revolution did destroy the landed nobility, and it did destroy the commercial bourgeoisie. Property was nationalized, the class categories were legally abolished, and a very large number of people fled, died, or were killed. Nobody should soften that. In terms of the criteria we have been building, it meets them. Total ideological commitment, physical elimination, dissolution of the legal form. And yet within a very few years the Soviet state was employing tens of thousands of the Tsarist-educated professional class in senior technical and administrative positions, under a specific official designation. They were called bourgeois specialists, bourgeoisnia spezi, and they were engineers, statisticians, accountants, agronomists, army officers, professors. The Bolsheviks despised them, watched them, periodically arrested them in show trials like the Shakti case in 1928 and the Industrial Party trial in 1930, and could not do without them. Lenin argued for paying them at rates far above party maximums, which caused enormous internal resentment, on the grounds that the alternative was that nothing would function. Sheila Fitzpatrick's work on this period is the place to go if you want the detail, and the detail is uncomfortable for everybody. A revolution that had explicitly set out to abolish the educated class as a category found itself, inside 18 months, negotiating salaries with it. You can kill the owners. You cannot kill the people who know how the thing works, because the thing stops working. And the people who know how the thing works are, in every society that has ever existed, drawn overwhelmingly from the same families as the owners, because the knowledge and the ownership were produced by the same childhood. That is the mechanism. Not conspiracy. Not even self-interest exactly. Necessity, the incoming regime, whatever it is, needs the trains to run and the accounts to balance and the harvest to be assessed and the water to keep coming out of the pipe, and the only people who know how to do any of that are the people who were doing it before. This is true of a Visigothic king in Toulouse, an American general in Tokyo, a Manchu prince in Beijing, and a revolutionary committee in Petrograd, and every one of them made the same calculation, and every one of them made it fast. Which means the elite's real asset is not wealth, and it is not even standing. It is indispensability. And indispensability is the one asset that gets more valuable precisely when everything else is being destroyed. I want to test that against the case where we have the best data of all, the most recent, the most thoroughly documented, and by a wide margin the most brazen. Because in 1991, a state with a population of 290 million, controlling the largest landmass on Earth and something like a fifth of the world's mineral reserves, ceased to exist. All property in it was owned by the state. There was no private ownership of productive assets, no stock market, no legal mechanism for an individual to hold a factory or an oil field. The ruling class of that state held its position purely through political office, in a party that was, in December of that year, abolished. Every asset that class held was, in principle, wiped out in a single stroke. Within 5 years, the same people owned the country. Let me be precise about that claim, because it is the kind of claim that gets thrown around loosely and it happens to be measurable. In 1994, the Institute of Sociology of the Russian Academy of Sciences carried out a survey of the composition of the new Russian elite, comparing biographies against the old Soviet Nomenklatura lists. The work was led by a sociologist named Olga Krishtanovskaya, and she published it internationally with Stephen White of the University of Glasgow in the journal Europe-Asia Studies in 1996. Of the people in Boris Yeltsin's immediate political circle, 75% came from the Soviet Nomenklatura. Of the government, 74%. Of the regional leadership, 83%. And of the new business elite, the men who had appeared from nowhere as the owners of Russian industry, 61%. Krishtanovskaya's phrase for what had happened is worth repeating exactly, because it is the least euphemistic description of a revolution I have ever encountered from a serious academic. She described it as a revolution in which a younger generation of the nomenklatura ousted its older rivals. The Soviet Union did not fall to its enemies. It was disassembled by its own middle management, who kept the pieces. And the mechanism is documented in legislative detail, which is the part that still astonishes me, because it means you can watch it happen in the statute book. The law on the state enterprise came into force in 1988, having been adopted the previous year. Its stated purpose was to give Soviet enterprises autonomy from central planning. What it actually did was transfer effective control of state productive assets from the ministries to the enterprise directors, while leaving formal ownership with the state. The director could now decide what to produce, whom to sell it to, and at what price for a growing share of output. He did not own the factory. He simply decided everything about it, and nobody above him could easily overrule him. The law on cooperatives followed in May 1988. It permitted the formation of private cooperative businesses. Read alongside the enterprise law, the combination is remarkable. A state enterprise director could now establish a cooperative, of which he or his relatives or his associates were members. And that cooperative could purchase the enterprise's output at state prices and sell it at market prices, with the difference accruing to private individuals. The state enterprise supplied the goods, the cooperative took the margin. This was not a loophole that clever people found. It is what the two laws do when placed next to each other, and they were passed within a year by the same body. Then there is the piece that almost nobody outside Russia has heard of, and it is the one I think is genuinely the origin point. In 1987, the Komsomol, the Communist Party's youth organization, was authorized to establish what were called Centers for Scientific and Technical Creativity of Youth. The stated purpose was to let young people commercialize innovations. The actual function was that these centers were granted the right to convert non-cash rubles into cash rubles. You need to understand what that means, because it is the strangest financial arbitrage of the 20th century. The Soviet economy ran two separate ruble circuits. Non-cash rubles were accounting units used between state enterprises, which could be moved around a ledger to authorize the transfer of goods, but could not be spent on anything a person wanted. Cash rubles were what people were paid in, and what bought bread. The two were legally not convertible, and the entire monetary control system of the Soviet Union rested on that separation. the Komsomol centres were given permission to cross the line. They could take non-cash balances from state enterprises, run them through their accounts, and produce cash. Enterprises had vast non-cash balances that were essentially useless to them, and they were willing to part with them at a steep discount for real money. The men who ran those centres were, by definition, Komsomol officials. They were selected for political reliability. They were young. And they were handed, at the age of 25 or 30, the only legal money printing operation in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was deputy head of the Komsomol Committee at the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow. He founded one of these centres. It became a bank called Menotep in 1989. Menotep would, 6 years later, acquire the Yukos oil company. That is not a rags to riches story, and it is important not to let it be told as one. It is a story about a young party functionary being granted a regulatory privilege that no one outside the party structure could obtain, and compounding it for 6 years. Then came the phase usually called spontaneous privatization, running from about 1988 to 1991, in which enterprise directors, using the autonomy the law had granted them, simply began transferring assets into structures they controlled. There was no privatization program yet. There was no legal framework for private ownership of large enterprises. It happened anyway, because the people with physical control of the assets were the only people in a position to say who owned them, and the state above them was disintegrating. By the time formal privatization began under Anatoly Shubai's in 1992, a great deal of the most valuable property in the country had already changed hands informally. The formal program is the part everyone knows about, and it is, in a sense, the least important. Every Russian citizen received a voucher with a nominal value of 10,000 rubles. In principle, this was the most egalitarian privatization ever attempted, distributing ownership of the national capital stock to 148 million people. In practice, hyperinflation destroyed the value of the vouchers almost immediately. Most citizens sold theirs for cash or a bottle of vodka within months, and voucher funds accumulated them in enormous blocks. The population received, collectively, a small fraction of the value of what was sold. And then, in 1995, came the scheme that I do not think has a real parallel anywhere in economic history. The Russian government was in fiscal crisis and facing an election the following year in which the Communist Party was leading the polls. A group of bankers, led by Vladimir Potanin of Uneximbank, proposed an arrangement. They would lend the government money. The government would put up shares in the largest state enterprises as collateral. If the government did not repay by a certain date, the banks could auction the shares. The government borrowed something in the region of $800 million against stakes in 12 of the most valuable industrial enterprises in Russia. It did not repay. The banks ran the auctions. In most cases, the bank running the auction was also the winning bidder, and in several cases competing bids were disqualified on technicalities by the bank conducting the sale. The numbers are the reason people still argue about Russia 30 years later. Menotep acquired 78% of Yukos for approximately $309 million. Yukos at that moment held proven reserves in the region of 14 billion barrels of oil. Brent crude was trading around $17 a barrel. Work out the implied price of the reserves, and you get something in the region of 6 cents a barrel. Not $6, 6 cents, for oil that could be sold for $17. Uneximbank acquired control of Norilsk Nickel, which produced a very large share of the world's palladium and a substantial share of its nickel, for around $170 million. Norilsk Nickel has in recent years been valued in the tens of billions. Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich acquired Sibneft for around $100 million. Abramovich sold his stake back to the Russian state in 2005 for $13 billion. I have gone back and forth on how to present those figures, because the standard framing that the assets were sold for 100th of their value is both roughly true and slightly misleading. The enterprises in 1995 were badly run, tax delinquent, subject to enormous political risk, and in several cases not clearly controllable by whoever nominally owned them. A rational buyer would have applied a very large discount, but the discount applied was not a rational risk adjustment. It was the price of an auction with one bidder, and everyone involved knew it at the time. Even Shubais, who designed the program and defended it for the rest of his career on the grounds that the alternative was a communist restoration, has never seriously argued the prices were fair. His argument is that the prices were the point, that the assets had to be put in the hands of people with an overwhelming personal interest in preventing the return of the old system, and that this was worth almost any price. Which is a coherent argument. It is also an admission that the Russian state deliberately created an oligarchy as a political defense mechanism, and then that oligarchy owned the country. But I promised you honest counter-argument, and there is a real one here, and it complicates the neat version. Not all of the oligarchs were Nomenklatura. Berezovsky was a mathematician with a doctorate who had worked at the Institute of Controlled Sciences. Several of the 7 bankers who dominated the mid-90s came from backgrounds that the Soviet system had specifically excluded from the political ladder, including a number who were Jewish and had found the party career track effectively closed. Some came from the black market economy, the Tolkaki and the shadow traders who had operated in the interstices of the planned economy for decades. The 61% figure for the business elite is the highest of the 4 figures in the survey, but it is also the lowest, in the sense that it leaves 39% unaccounted for, which is a very large minority of genuinely new people. And Krishtanovskaya's later work found extremely high churn. Studying the business elite over time, she found that only around 15% of the people who were in the top tier in 1993 were still there in 2001. That is not a stable hereditary class. That is a knife fight. T. H. Rigby, working with a narrower definition of the political elite, argued that hardly any of the very top Soviet figures passed directly into the very top post-Soviet positions. The general secretaries and Politburo members did not become oligarchs. The people who became oligarchs were, for the most part, 1 or 2 levels down, in their 30s and 40s in 1985, positioned to take advantage of a change they had not caused. The honest formulation is not that the Soviet elite became the Russian elite. It is that the Soviet elite's second tier became the Russian elite, at enormous cost to the first tier, with a meaningful minority of genuine outsiders admitted at the point where the outsiders had skills the insiders lacked. Which, if you have been following, is exactly what happened in Gaul. Sidonius did not remain prefect of Rome. He became a bishop, which was a step down in the old hierarchy and a step up in the new one. The Gallo-Roman aristocracy did not survive as the Gallo-Roman aristocracy. It survived as something else that it became on purpose. And the comparison across post-communist Europe makes the pattern sharper, because the outcome varied enormously and the variation is explicable. Even Shelenyi, with Gileal and Eleanor Townsley, argued in a 1998 study that Central Europe took a different path. In Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, the transition was managed by a coalition of technocrats, distant intellectuals and reform economists, and the resulting arrangement was capitalism built by people who were not themselves becoming the capitalists. They called it capitalism without capitalists. Jadwiga Staniskis, working from Poland, emphasized the opposite, the direct conversion of nomenklatura position into ownership, and coined the term political capitalism for it. Both processes happened everywhere, the proportions differed, and the variable that best explains the difference is whether the country possessed an organised counter-elite at the moment of transition. Poland had Solidarity, a mass movement with 10 million members and its own leadership cadre. Czechoslovakia had a dissident network with international standing. Hungary had a reform intelligentsia embedded in the party itself. Russia had nothing. The dissident movement had been broken in the 70s. There was no organised alternative leadership, no shadow administration, no institution outside the party with the capacity to staff a government. When the party dissolved, there was literally no one else in the building. That is the same finding again, arrived at from the opposite direction. The elite survives when there is no one available to replace it. Which is not a statement about the elite's power, it is a statement about everyone else's absence. And now I have to bring in the piece of evidence that I think is the single most disturbing thing in this entire subject, because it removes the possibility that any of this is about specific historical circumstances at all. In 1427, the Republic of Florence, needing money for a war against Milan, conducted the most detailed tax survey undertaken anywhere in Europe before the modern era. It was called the Catasto. Every household in the city and its territory was required to declare its wealth, its property, its debts and its dependents. Roughly 10,000 households in the city itself were assessed, with names, occupations and net worth recorded in ledgers that still exist. In 2011, the Italian tax authority had a database of every taxpayer in Florence, with names, occupations and declared incomes. Two economists at the Bank of Italy, Guglielmo Barone and Sauro Massetti, matched the two by surname. Their paper was published in the Review of Economic Studies. The finding is that the elasticity of earnings between the two populations, across a gap of nearly 600 years and roughly 20 generations, is around 0.04. That number sounds small. In the context of what standard models of social mobility predict over 6 centuries, it is enormous. A conventional intergenerational correlation of the sort economists usually measure, applied 20 times in succession, should produce something statistically indistinguishable from zero. It should be gone. All of it. It is not gone. The families that were at the top of the wealth distribution in Florence in 1427, in the decade before the Medici took the city, when Brunelleschi was building the dome, were on average still at the top in 2011. The effect is stronger for wealth than for income, which is the detail that tells you what is actually being transmitted. 600 years. In between, Florence experienced the rise and fall and rise and final expulsion of the Medici, the Savonarola theocracy, the siege of 1529, absorption into a hereditary duchy, absorption into a Habsburg possession, French occupation under Napoleon, the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy, a stint as the capital of that new country, the First World War, Mussolini, the German occupation, the front line of 1944 passing directly through the city with every bridge but one destroyed, and the flood of 1966. The surnames sat through all of it. I want to be careful, because there are real limitations to surname studies. Surnames are inherited patrilineally and imperfectly, they are shared by unrelated families, they cluster geographically, and in Italy some of them are extremely common. Barone and Massetti restrict themselves to surnames that were rare enough to be informative, and they are explicit about the limits. But the direction of the bias runs against them. Noise in surname matching dilutes measured persistence. The real figure is more likely to be higher than what they found, not lower. That study is one of a family of studies, and the most ambitious and most argued about of them belongs to Gregory Clark, an economic historian at the University of California, Davis. Clark's method is to take rare surnames associated with elite status at some historical moment and then track their frequency in elite positions over the following centuries. attendance at Oxford and Cambridge, membership of the medical register, probate records, parliamentary seats. If a surname is 10 times overrepresented at Oxford in 1600, how overrepresented is it in 1800 and in 2000? His answer, published in 2014, is that the rate of decay implies an underlying intergenerational correlation of status of around 0.75. The conventional figure, measured by looking at fathers and sons on a single variable like income, is between 0.3 and 0.5. Clark's claim is that the conventional measure is picking up the noisy surface of an underlying variable that is far more persistent, and that the underlying variable moves toward the mean at a rate of only about a quarter per generation. His further claim, which is what generated the argument, is that the figure is roughly the same in England, the United States, Sweden, India, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Chile. Sweden, with a century of comprehensive social democracy, comes out barely different from England. Clark writes that social status is inherited about as strongly as height. I have gone around and around on this one, and I want to give you my honest position, which is that I think he is measuring something real, and I think he is over-interpreting it. The critiques are serious. Miles Korak and others have pointed out that comparing surname groups rather than individuals mechanically produces higher persistence estimates, because you are averaging out exactly the individual variation that the conventional measures capture. Reviewers in the Economic History Review have argued that what Clark calls a law of social mobility is better described as a description of how a selected elite group regresses toward the mean, which is a different and less universal claim. And there is a selection problem at the root of it, because surnames become identifiable as elite precisely by being unusually successful, and unusually successful things tend to have unusually persistent characteristics for reasons that may have nothing to do with a general law. What I think survives all of that criticism is the comparative finding. Whatever Clark is measuring, he measures roughly the same amount of it in Sweden as in England as in Chile. Institutional arrangements that differ enormously in their explicit redistribution produce persistence figures that differ far less than anyone would predict. That is not a claim about a universal constant. It is a claim that the levers we normally think of as determining social mobility are operating on something shallower than the thing that actually persists, and it forces the question that this entire subject comes down to: what is the thing that actually persists? The answer has to explain a very specific pattern, and I want to state the pattern precisely before I try to explain it, because the pattern is strange. Collapse is not random in what it takes, it is startlingly consistent, and the best place to watch it operate at high resolution, because it happened fast and in a literate society with excellent records, is Germany in 1923. At the start of 1922, the mark traded at about 190 to the dollar. By November 1923, it took 4.2 trillion. A loaf of bread in Berlin cost around 200 billion marks. People were paid twice a day and ran to spend it. There are photographs of children building towers out of banknotes, of a woman lighting a stove with them, of a wheelbarrow of currency being stolen with the currency tipped out on the pavement so the thief could have the wheelbarrow. Now, who exactly was destroyed by that? Not the poor, primarily, though they suffered enormously in real terms through the collapse of wages and the food shortages. Not the peasantry, who had food and land, and who in many cases did extremely well selling into the cities. And not, emphatically, the industrialists. The people destroyed were the ones who had done exactly what the society had told them to do. The savers. The holders of war bonds, who had lent their money to their country in 1914 out of patriotism and were repaid in confetti. The retired officials on fixed pensions. The widows living on the income from mortgages and government paper. the professional middle class whose assets were financial claims rather than physical things. In German, this class had a name, the Rentner Mittelstand, and by the end of 1923, it did not exist. A lifetime of savings bought a tram ticket, and then did not buy a tram ticket. And the reason this matters for our question is that a financial claim is a promise made by an institution. That is all it is. A bond is a promise. A savings deposit is a promise. A pension is a promise. Cash is a promise. When the institution fails, the promise fails, and the person holding it has nothing, because what they were holding was never a thing at all. It was a relationship with a system. Meanwhile, consider Hugo Stinnes. Stinnes was a Ruhr industrialist born 1870, the grandson of a coal merchant who had built a substantial business before the war. What he understood about the inflation, earlier and more completely than almost anyone else, was that it made debt free. If you borrow marks and the marks lose 99.99% of their value before you repay, you have been given the money. He borrowed, enormously, continuously, from banks that were themselves being destroyed by the same process, and he used the borrowed marks to buy things that were not marks. Coal mines, steel works, shipping lines, newspapers, of which he eventually owned a large number, and hotels, and forests, and a bank. By 1923, he controlled something in the region of a fifth of German industry, and was called in the press the Inflation King. And I want to give you the ending of that story too, because it is the ironic parallel that keeps this from being a simple morality tale. The strategy was leverage against hard assets, and it worked spectacularly as long as the currency was collapsing. Stinnes died in April 1924, aged 54, a few months after the currency was stabilized. His sons continued the strategy into an environment of hard money and deflation, where leverage cuts the other way. The empire was in serious trouble within 2 years, and was substantially broken up by 1925 and 26. The lesson people take from Stinnes is usually that he was a genius or a vulture. The lesson I take is narrower, and I think more useful. He was not smarter than the widows. He held a different category of asset. Everyone holding a promise lost everything, and everyone holding a thing kept it. And the difference in outcome had nothing to do with the difference in virtue, intelligence, effort, or foresight. That is what a collapse does. Collapse does not destroy at random. It selects, and the selection is extremely consistent across 2,000 years and every continent I have looked at. It destroys claims, and it preserves objects. It destroys the abstract, and preserves the physical. It destroys anything whose value depends on a specific institution continuing to honour a specific commitment, and it leaves untouched anything whose value is intrinsic to the thing itself, which is a fairly clean description of the difference between how ordinary people hold wealth and how rich people hold wealth, and always has been. The median household in any developed country today holds its wealth as a pension claim, a bank deposit, an insurance policy, an employment contract, an entitlement to state provision, and equity in a house that is mortgaged. Almost every one of those is a promise. The house is the exception, and the house is mortgaged, which means it is a physical asset with a promise wrapped around it in the wrong direction. That is not a moral failure, and it is not stupidity. A person of ordinary means has no other way available to hold wealth in a modern economy. The instruments available to you are institutional instruments. You are required, structurally, to hold your life in the form that collapse destroys. We now have a mechanism that accounts for the pattern. Collapse burns claims and spares things. Elites hold things. Therefore, elites survive collapses. And there is a second layer on top of it, which is that the incoming regime needs administrators, and administrators come from the same families as the owners. so even where the things are taken, the people are needed. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the question that the most important book on this subject was written to answer. If that is all true, has inequality ever actually gone down? And if so, how? The answer is yes. 4 times. And you will not like the 4. Walter Scheidel is a historian at Stanford who trained as a Roman social and economic historian and then did something unusual, which was to take the methods of ancient economic history and apply them to the entire span of recorded human experience. In 2017, he published a book with a title that sounds gentle and a thesis that is not. His question was straightforward. Across all of recorded history, in every society for which we have usable evidence, what has ever caused a substantial and sustained reduction in inequality? His answer is 4 things, and he calls them the 4 horsemen of levelling. The first is mass mobilization warfare, not war generally. Wars of the specific 20th century type that conscript a very large fraction of the male population, require confiscatory taxation, destroy capital on an industrial scale, and reorganize the entire economy around production for the state. The 2 world wars did more to compress inequality in the developed world than any policy program in history, through a combination of physical destruction of assets, hyperinflation and default, top marginal tax rates that reached 94% in the United States and 98% in Britain, and the political mobilization of a population that had been asked to die and came back asking for something. The second is transformative revolution, not political revolution, which as we have seen mostly reshuffles, communist revolution specifically, in Russia and China and their imitators, which set out to abolish private ownership of productive assets as a category and did so at a cost in human life that runs into 8 figures. The third is state collapse, the complete failure of a political order such that the elite's property rights simply cease to be enforceable, because there is no one left to enforce them. This levels by destroying everyone, and Scheidel is at pains to point out that it usually produces equality in poverty rather than equality in prosperity. The fourth is catastrophic plague. The Black Death killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe, and in doing so produced the largest sustained real wage increase in recorded European history, because labour became scarce and land became abundant, which is the exact inversion of the normal condition. English real wages roughly doubled over the following century and did not return to their pre-plague level in some estimates until the 19th century. That is the list. Scheidel's contention is that it is exhaustive. Land reform without violence, debt relief, democratic redistribution, progressive taxation absent war, economic development, education and financial crisis have between them produced no sustained levelling of consequence anywhere at any time. The instances of major compression are, on his reading, all attributable to one or more of the 4. I have read the critiques carefully because I wanted him to be wrong. Michael Mann's review is the sharpest. He argues that Scheidel understates the role of political agency, that the 20th century compression was not simply a mechanical consequence of war, but the outcome of specific labour movements, specific electoral coalitions, and specific policy choices that could have gone differently, and that the causal arrow may run the other way, in that a society with a relatively egalitarian and mobilised population is capable of mass mobilisation warfare in the first place, where an oligarchic one is not. Others have pointed out that the sample is dominated by agrarian societies, that inequality measurement before the modern era carries error bars wide enough to drive a truck through, and that the 4 categories are broad enough to absorb almost any counterexample. I think Mann is right that the mechanism is more political than Scheidel allows. I think the empirical pattern stands anyway, and stands with a force that I have not been able to argue myself out of. Even if you attribute the 20th century compression entirely to labour movements and social democratic politics rather than to the wars themselves, you still have to explain why those movements achieved what they achieved in the specific window between 1914 and 1975, and not before and not since. And the honest answer is that they were operating in the aftermath of the largest destruction of capital in human history, with the bargaining position that a war economy gives to labour in societies that had just been required to arm their entire male population, which is not a comfortable finding for anyone. It suggests that the most egalitarian period in the history of the developed world was a byproduct of the most catastrophic one, and that the arrangement it produced has been quietly reverting since about the time the last generation with direct memory of it began to retire. Peter Turchin's structural demographic work approaches the same territory from a different angle, and I find it useful even where I am sceptical of the machinery. His central concept is elite overproduction, the idea that societies periodically produce more people with elite credentials and elite expectations than there are elite positions to hold them, and that the resulting competition among frustrated aspirants is a reliable leading indicator of political instability. He builds this into a quantitative model with cycles, and the quantitative part is where mainstream historians tend to get off the bus, because the data required to fit those models to pre-modern societies mostly does not exist at the resolution the models require. But the underlying observation is one that anyone who has looked at a law school graduating class in the last 15 years can verify without a model. And it connects to our question in a way Turchin does not always emphasise. Elite overproduction is what happens when a class successfully reproduces itself faster than the positions it needs. The Chinese examination system generated it continuously and spectacularly, with tens of thousands of degree holders competing for a few thousand posts, and the surplus went into local gentry roles, teaching, medicine, land management, and, when things got bad, rebellion. Huang Chao, the man who destroyed the Tang aristocracy, was a failed examination candidate. There is something almost unbearable in that. The system that produced the most durable elite in world history also produced, as a direct byproduct, the one man who managed to kill an elite permanently. Now let me close out the counter cases properly, because I said at the start that I would give you the honest version, and the honest version includes the places where everything I have argued fails. There are, as far as I can establish, 5 clean instances of an entrenched elite being permanently destroyed as a class. The Tang aristocracy, the Japanese rural landlords, the Chinese landlord and gentry class, the Cambodian educated class, and the planter class of Saint-Domingue. Cambodia is the case that is hardest to talk about, and it needs to be in here. Between April 1975 and January 1979, the Khmer Rouge emptied the cities, abolished money, abolished markets, abolished schools, abolished the postal system, and set out to eliminate anyone associated with the old order. The category expanded as these categories do, from officials and officers to teachers, to anyone who spoke a foreign language, to anyone who wore glasses, on the reasoning that glasses indicated reading. Estimates of the death toll run from 1.5 to 2 million out of a population of around 8 million. The educated class of Cambodia was, in a period of 44 months, largely killed. Saint-Domingue is the other. The wealthiest colony in the world in 1789, producing something approaching 40% of the world's sugar and more than half its coffee on the labour of 500,000 enslaved people. The revolution that began in 1791 and ended with Haitian independence in 1804 destroyed the planter class absolutely. They were killed or they fled, the plantations were broken up, and the class never reconstituted. It is the only case in the modern era of a colonial slaveholding elite being eliminated by the people it enslaved, and the price France extracted for recognising the outcome, an indemnity imposed in 1825 of 150 million francs, later reduced, which Haiti was still paying into the 20th century, is one of the more direct demonstrations available of what happens to a society that succeeds at this. Look at what those 5 cases have in common, and the pattern is not subtle. Every one required the physical killing of a very large number of people over a sustained period, with the explicit intention of eliminating a category rather than punishing individuals. Every one occurred when the elite in question was geographically concentrated within reach of the people doing the killing. Every one involved the destruction of the legal instruments that held the property, not merely a change in who administered them. And in 4 of the 5, the resulting society was very much poorer for a very long time afterward. Japan is the only exception on that last point, and Japan is the exception because the reform was carried out by an occupying army with total authority, no stake in the outcome, and a functioning bureaucracy to administer it, compensating the losers with paper that inflation then destroyed. It was, in effect, an expropriation conducted with perfect administrative competence by a power that could not be resisted and did not need to be popular. That is not a repeatable political condition. It is an artifact of unconditional surrender. Here is where the argument stands, and I want to state it cleanly before we go to the last part, because the last part is the part I have been building towards since the first minute. Elites survive collapse because collapse destroys claims rather than things, because the incoming order needs administrators and there is nowhere else to get them, and because relative standing is convertible in a way that quantities of money are not. Elites are destroyed only by sustained mass killing directed at a category, and that killing only works when the category is concentrated somewhere the killers can reach, and it always requires the simultaneous destruction of the legal container holding the property, which means the historical vulnerability of every elite that has ever been destroyed comes down to a single condition. And it is the condition I flagged in the first 10 minutes and gestured at again in the middle and have not yet named. Their wealth was in the same place as the state that fell. The Tang clans had moved to the capital, and the capital was sacked. Melania's fortune was in 8 provinces, and the provinces were conquered one by one. The Japanese landlords held land on a Japanese register administered by a Japanese ministry, now taking orders from an American general. The Chinese lineage estates were fields in Jiangsu and Guangdong, and the fields were where the work teams arrived. The Saint-Domingue planters owned plantations on the island of Saint-Domingue. The Haitian Revolution could reach them because they were standing on the asset. Co-location. That is the whole vulnerability. In every case in the historical record, the assets of the elite were physically and legally inside the jurisdiction that collapsed, which meant that whoever ended up holding the machinery of that jurisdiction could reach them. For the entire span of human history until extremely recently, this was not a solvable problem. Land does not move. Legal title is only as good as the courts that recognise it, and the courts that recognise it are the courts of the place where the land is. You could hold property in several provinces of the same empire, as Melania did, and that gave you some protection against local disaster and none whatsoever against the failure of the empire. You could put your land inside an immortal legal fiction, as Zhongyan did, and that protected you against inheritance and creditors and individual disgrace, and gave you nothing at all against a work team with a mandate from a new government. The elite's problem for 4,000 years was that it lived in the same building as the fire. That is no longer true, and it is not less true than it used to be, or true in a qualified sense, or trending toward being untrue. It has been comprehensively, deliberately and successfully solved in our lifetimes by people who were entirely aware of what they were solving. Before I do, I want to say something about how I came to be able to say any of this, because I think the answer is part of the story. Every load-bearing claim I have made in the last 2 hours comes from a named academic working in a mainstream institution, publishing through ordinary channels. Tackett at Berkeley with the tomb epitaphs. Heinzelmann and Strohecker counting Gallic bishops. Himes at Columbia in the Fuso archives. Krishtanovskaya at the Russian Academy of Sciences, publishing her figures in a British journal in 1996 while the men she was describing were still acquiring the assets. Barone and Massetti at the Bank of Italy. Scheidel at Stanford. Shrubsole with a laptop and freedom of information requests. Dower, Johnson, Wickham, Ward Perkins, Fitzpatrick, Decotta, Higgs, none of them were suppressed. Several of them are extremely well known within their fields, and 1 or 2 are famous outside them. The German government commissioned the studies that found the Nazi Party membership figures in its own ministries and then published the results. The findings are not fringe, not contested in outline, and not difficult to obtain, and they have had, as far as I can tell, no effect whatsoever on what any society believes about how collapse distributes its losses. The reason is not censorship. The reason is that each of these findings lives inside a separate discipline with its own journals and its own conferences and its own vocabulary. And nobody is paid to notice that a study of 9th century Chinese tomb inscriptions and a study of the composition of the 1994 Russian government and a study of Florentine tax records are describing the same phenomenon. The specialization that makes the research possible is the thing that prevents it from being assembled. There is no discipline of elite persistence. There is no chair in it. It falls between economic history, sociology, prosopography, area studies and law, and the space between those fields is not empty, it is simply unattended, which is a much more ordinary and much more durable form of ignorance than a conspiracy, because a conspiracy can be exposed and an absence cannot. Nobody is hiding this. It is merely that the assembly of it is not anybody's job, and it has therefore never been anybody's job for as long as the disciplines have existed in their current form. I keep coming back to Sidonius and his letters for this reason. He spent a great deal of effort curating them for publication, arranging them, polishing the Latin. Presenting himself as a cultivated Roman gentleman, corresponding with other cultivated Roman gentlemen about estates and poetry and the tiresome manners of the Burgundians who had been billeted in his neighbourhood. He was building a monument to a world he could feel ending. What the letters actually preserve to a reader 1500 years later is not the world. It is the Manuv. 9 volumes of a man documenting, in exhaustive and self-satisfied detail, exactly how a governing class transferred itself out of a dying institution and into a living one, entirely without noticing that this was what he was describing. He thought he was writing an elegy. He was writing a manual. I want to go through what today's elite is actually accumulating, and I want to do it strictly as evidence rather than as prophecy, because the moment this turns into speculation about a coming collapse, it becomes worthless. I am not predicting anything. I am describing an asset allocation, and then I am going to ask you to compare it to the list of things that historically survive. Start with credentials, because credentials are the oldest instrument on the list, and the Chinese case has already told us what they do. In 2023, Raj Chetty at Harvard, David Deming at Harvard, and John Friedman at Brown published a study using anonymized tax records linked to admissions data from what they call the Ivy Plus colleges, the 8 Ivy League universities plus Chicago, Duke, MIT, and Stanford. These institutions educate well under 0.5% of Americans. They supply more than 10% of Fortune 500 chief executives, about 1/4 of United States senators, half of all Rhodes Scholars, and roughly 3/4 of the Supreme Court justices appointed in the last 50 years. 15% of the people in the top 1/10 of 1% of the income distribution went to one of 12 schools. That is concentration, and concentration alone would not be interesting. The finding that matters is the second one. Children from families in the top 1% of the income distribution are more than twice as likely to attend one of these institutions as children from middle-class families with identical standardized test scores. Identical, the gap is not academic preparation, it is legacy preference. Athletic recruitment in sports that require expensive childhood participation, and the assessment of non-academic credentials that are themselves produced by money. For legacy applicants specifically, an applicant from a top 1% family is around 5 times more likely to be admitted than a comparably qualified applicant without that connection. The British version is starker because Britain does not bother to disguise it. The Sutton Trust and the Social Mobility Commission publish a periodic study of the educational backgrounds of the people who run the country. 7% of the British population attends private school. Around 1% attends Oxford or Cambridge. Of senior judges, 65% were privately educated. Of permanent secretaries, the civil servants who actually run the departments of state, 59%. Of the House of Lords, 57%. Of diplomats, 52%. Of newspaper columnists, 44%. France runs the same system through the Grandes Écoles, with the added elegance that the French version is explicitly meritocratic, entirely examination-based, and produces an even tighter concentration of political and administrative power than the British one. Now put that beside Fan Zhongyan's righteous estate and the machine he built for converting land into degrees and degrees back into land. It is the same instrument, a credential that is nominally open to all, allocated by an examination that is genuinely difficult, and in practice acquired by the children of the people who already hold it at a rate that is not explicable by ability. It survives regime change because the new regime needs administrators and takes them from wherever administrators are certified. It is not confiscable. There is no legal mechanism anywhere in the world for taking a degree away from a class of people. Then there is the second instrument, and this is the one where the historical break actually happens. Gabriel Zuckman, working from the discrepancies in international financial statistics, the fact that globally reported liabilities exceed reported assets by an amount that has to be somewhere, estimated that around 8% of global household financial wealth is held offshore. That is the average. The distribution around the average is what matters. In Scandinavia, it is a few percent of national income. In continental Europe, around 15. In Russia and much of the Gulf and parts of Latin America, it runs to 60% of household financial wealth held outside the country. And within any country, the holding is concentrated almost entirely in the top fraction of a percent, because you need several million to make the structures worth building. And then there is the domestic version, which in the United States has grown at a rate that I do not think has registered publicly at all. South Dakota, a state with fewer than 1 million residents, abolished the rule against perpetuities in 1983. The rule against perpetuities is a piece of English common law dating to the 17th century which exists for a specific reason. It prevents a dead person from controlling property indefinitely. In its classic formulation, an interest must vest within 21 years of the death of someone alive when the interest was created, which in practice caps a trust at somewhere around a century. It was invented precisely to stop dynasties from locking up land forever, and it worked for 300 years. South Dakota removed it. Nevada, Delaware, Alaska, and a number of others followed in the decades after, competing for the business. A South Dakota trust can, in principle, run forever. It pays no state income tax. It offers extremely strong asset protection against creditors and, in certain configurations, against claims arising from divorce. Its records are sealed by court order in a way that is unusual even by the standards of trust law. Assets held in South Dakota trusts stood at around $104 billion in 2011. By 2018, it was $234 billion. By 2021, it had passed $600 billion. Recent figures put it above $800 billion. Read the structure of that and tell me it is not familiar. The property is not owned by any person. It is owned by a legal fiction that does not die, cannot be divided by inheritance, cannot be reached by an individual beneficiary's creditors, and is administered under the law of a jurisdiction chosen specifically because that law is favourable and is unlikely to change, since the state in question has built a significant part of its economy around not changing it. Zhongyan, 1050. Sioux Falls, 1983. Same instrument, and the second one is better, because Fan's estate was farmland in Suzhou, and the work teams came to Suzhou in 1950, and a South Dakota trust holds securities in companies incorporated in a dozen jurisdictions, with custodians in several more, none of which need be in the same country as the beneficiaries, or the settlor, or the trustee. Third instrument, land, and here the picture is more traditional and in some ways more startling. Guy Shrubsole spent years assembling the ownership map of England from land registry data, freedom of information requests and estate records, and published the results in 2019. His central finding is that less than 1% of the population owns around half of England. The aristocracy and landed gentry, a category he defines carefully, still hold something in the region of 30%, and roughly 17% of the land of England and Wales remains entirely unregistered, because registration was only triggered by sale, which means the unregistered portion consists disproportionately of estates that have never been sold since compulsory registration began. Land that has not changed hands since before the land registry existed, in a country that has had, in the intervening period, the extension of the franchise, 2 world wars, the creation and partial dismantling of a welfare state, the loss of an empire, and the near-total transformation of its economy. Fourth, and this one is the least discussed, and possibly the most consequential over a long horizon, marriage. The economists Jeremy Greenwood, Nezi Guna, Georgy Kochakov, and Cesar Santos published a study in the American Economic Review in 2014 examining the effect of assortative mating on household income inequality in the United States. Assortative mating means people marrying people like themselves, and it has risen sharply since the 1960s, driven principally by the entry of educated women into the professional workforce, and by the increasing sorting of the population by educational institution. Their headline calculation is the one to remember. If married couples in 2005 had been matched randomly with respect to education, rather than assortatively, the Gini coefficient of household income in the United States would have fallen from the observed 0.43 to 0.34. That is a very large number. It is roughly the difference between the United States and Denmark, produced entirely by who marries whom, and it is precisely the mechanism Robert Himes found in the Fuzhou archives. The gentry families of Song and Ming China maintained local dominance across centuries, not primarily through examination success, which fluctuated, but through marriage alliances with other locally dominant families, which did not. The network was the asset. It is the asset now, and it is being reinforced by the same institutions that produce the credentials, which is not a coincidence, but a design feature, since the principal function of a residential university in the reproduction of an elite has always been partly matrimonial. Fifth, and briefly, because it is the smallest in scale and the most reported. Second citizenship and physical relocation options. New Zealand relaunched its investor visa program in April 2025. In roughly the first 8 months, it received 573 applications, covering 1,833 people, against 116 applications in the preceding 2.5 years under the old rules. Around 40% of the people covered were Americans, more than double the number from China. The reporting on private retreats and bunkers in New Zealand and elsewhere is credible and well-sourced, and I think it is also somewhat overweighted in public attention relative to its actual significance, because a bunker is a fantasy object and a trust is a functioning legal machine. And sixth, the institutional wrapper for all of it. Deloitte's survey of the sector counted around 8,000 single-family offices worldwide in 2024, up from about 6,100 in 2019, managing something in the region of $3.1 trillion, with a projection of over 10,000 offices and $5.4 trillion by 2030. A single-family office is a private institution whose entire purpose is the intergenerational preservation of one family's position. That is not a description of a financial services product. That is a description of a lineage. Now put the two lists side by side. The things that historically survive a collapse are physical assets, land, credentials, marriage networks, position inside institutions that outlive the state, and property held by immortal legal fictions in jurisdictions other than the one that is failing. That is not a summary of the historical record that I have then applied to the present. It is the historical record, and it is also, item by item, the current asset allocation of the wealthiest fraction of a percent of every developed society on Earth. Not approximately. Item for item. And the things that historically burn are cash, bank deposits, government bonds, pension entitlements, insurance policies, employment contracts, state benefits, and equity in a mortgaged home. That is a description of the balance sheet of everyone else. Nobody sat down and designed that correspondence. There is no committee. What there is, and this is the part I find harder to shake than any conspiracy would be, is a very long process of selection. Families that held their wealth in claims did not persist through the ruptures. Families that held it in things did. Over enough centuries and enough collapses, the surviving population of elite families is composed entirely of the ones whose ancestors happen to be holding the right category of asset. And they transmit not just the assets, but the disposition, the family understanding of what property is and where it should be kept, which is why the advice given quietly in those families has been remarkably consistent for a very long time and has almost nothing in common with what is taught in a personal finance course. But that is the old pattern, and I have spent 2 hours getting you to the point where I can tell you why the new one is different. For the entire span of the historical record, the elite paid a price occasionally. Not often, not fairly, not in proportion to anything. But the four horsemen did run, and when they ran they took everything from everyone, and the reason they could take everything from the top as well as the bottom is that the top was standing in the same field. Every levelling event in Scheidel's 4 categories works by seizing, destroying or devaluing assets that are physically and legally inside the jurisdiction undergoing the catastrophe. Mass mobilization war works through confiscatory taxation and inflation, which require the wealth to be taxable and the currency to be the one held. Revolution works through expropriation, which requires the property to be within the reach of the expropriating state. State collapse works by removing the enforcement of property rights, which only matters if the rights are enforced by the state that collapsed. Plague works through the labour market of the affected region. All 4 are jurisdictional weapons. Every one of them requires the target to be inside. and the last 40 years have been, among other things, a sustained and highly successful legal engineering project to move the assets outside. Not to hide them, which is a different and cruder thing. To situate them, correctly and legally, and with full disclosure to the relevant authorities, in a structure and a jurisdiction where no single sovereign failure can reach them. An $800 billion pool of perpetual trusts in a state of 900,000 people. 8% of the world's household financial wealth held outside the country of the owner, rising to 60% in the places where the owners have most recently learned what a collapse looks like. Family offices holding trillions, structured across multiple jurisdictions by design rather than by accident. Second citizenships held by people who have no intention of ever using them, purchased for the same reason a ship carries lifeboats it expects never to launch. None of this is illegal. Almost none of it is even secret. The South Dakota legislature abolished the rule against perpetuities in a public vote in 1983, and you can read the debate. Zucman's numbers come from the International Monetary Fund's own balance of payment statistics. Chetty's paper is free to download. Shrubsole's maps are online. The Deloitte report is a marketing document. Which is where I end up, and it is not where I expected to end up when I started reading for this. I thought I was going to find a story about injustice. There is plenty of injustice in it. Krupp walking out of Landsberg. Fritz Termeer in the Bayer annual report. 6 cents a barrel, but injustice is the shallow reading, and it is the one that lets you off, because injustice implies somebody to be angry at, and anger is a complete emotion that finishes itself. What I actually found is a structural fact about how societies work, which is that the class that administers a system is the only group in that system with the option of surviving its failure, because everybody else's position is defined by the system, and theirs is defined by the fact that they know how to run one. And that the historical corrective for this, the only one that has ever worked, required a scale of death that no one should want, and that in any case would no longer be sufficient, because the assets are no longer in the room. The Tang aristocracy could be destroyed because it had moved to Chang'an. The Jiangnan gentry could be destroyed because the land was in Jiangnan. The planters of Saint-Domingue could be destroyed because they were standing on the plantation. Every single elite in the historical record that was ever permanently removed was removed because it had made the mistake of keeping everything it owned in one place, and that place was the place that fell. That mistake has been corrected. And here is the last thing, and it is the one that I would like you to sit with rather than resolve, because I have not been able to resolve it either. There is a version of this where the correction is fine, where nothing collapses, the modern developed world continues indefinitely, the trusts compound quietly, the credentials sort the children, the marriages consolidate, and the only consequence is a slow and undramatic widening that families experience as their children, finding it slightly harder than they did. That is the most likely version. I want to be clear that I think it is the most likely version, but notice what it costs to say that. It means the argument is no longer about whether the elite survives the catastrophe. It is that the catastrophe has been made irrelevant to the elite, which means the only remaining mechanism by which the distribution of a society ever changes is ordinary politics. Conducted through ordinary institutions, against a class whose assets are held under the law of jurisdictions those institutions do not control, and whose administrative personnel those institutions cannot replace. That mechanism has, according to the most comprehensive survey of the historical record anyone has assembled, never worked. Not once. Not anywhere. Not in 5,000 years. Somewhere in the ground near Luoyang there is a stone that records the death of a woman of the Fanyang Lu in the year 880, along with 4 of her 5 children, none of whom left heirs. 3 lineages, each older than most European countries, ended in a single household in a single season, and the stone was carved by someone who could not have known that the archive was closing, that there would be no more epitaphs of that kind, that the 600-year-old world it belonged to had already stopped. It is the only document of its kind I have found in any of this. The moment where it actually happened, where the class did not adapt, did not convert, did not move into the church or the bureaucracy or the successor bank, but simply ended. It took the sack of 2 capital cities, 3 decades of massacre, and the physical deletion of the largest city on earth to produce it. And even then, the reason it worked was not the violence. Cities have been sacked before and since, and the families came back. It worked because they were all in one place. The trust in Sioux Falls has no expiry date. It does not need one. It is not going anywhere, and neither in the sense that matters is anything in it. It will be there in 100 years, and in 300. Holding assets in jurisdictions chosen by people who read the same history I have just read to you, and drew the correct conclusion from it a generation before anyone else thought to ask the question. Whatever happens to the country it is registered in will happen to the country. The trust does not live there,